The alarm on my console screamed before I even understood what it meant. Red light filled the observation deck, bouncing off the curved windows that looked down on a small blue planet called Earth. I had been stationed here for 3 years, watching, recording, filing reports that nobody important ever read. Earth was a footnote in the Coalition archives, a backwater, a world full of creatures who still argued over invisible lines drawn on maps and burned ancient plants for fuel. We called them primitive, and we said it the way you might describe a child who had not yet learned to tie their own shoes. My name is Kale Vasari, and until that morning, my biggest concern was whether the humans I studied would ever stop fighting each other long enough to notice the stars above them. The signal on my console was not from Earth. It was from deep space, far past the edge of the solar system, and it carried the emergency code every Coalition officer is trained to fear. Fleet in retreat, casualties heavy, enemy pursuing. I stood so fast my chair spun behind me and clattered against the wall. My hands moved across the console, pulling up every channel I had access to, and what I found made my chest tighten in a way it never had before. A Coalition battle group, 40 ships strong, one of the finest fleets in our arm of the galaxy, was fleeing toward Earth. Not advancing, not holding a line, fleeing. Behind them came something we had never faced before. Our scanners struggled to even classify it. The reports called it the Devourer Fleet, a name given in panic by whoever survived long enough to send the first warning. Nobody in the Coalition had seen this enemy up close and lived to describe it in detail. All we knew was that entire outposts along the frontier had gone silent within hours of contact. Not defeated, silent, erased, as if they had never existed at all. I opened a private channel to my direct superior, a Coalition commander named Thessaly Oren, stationed 2 systems away. Her face appeared on my screen, pale, her eyes darting to something off-camera. "KL," she said, her voice tight. "You have seen the reports." "I have." "Commander, what do we do? Earth has no defense fleet. They barely have defense against each other." She was quiet for a long moment. "That is exactly the problem. The Devourer fleet is heading directly for the Sol system. Our retreating ships are trying to draw them away, but they are failing. Earth sits directly in the projected path." My stomach dropped. The humans do not even know we exist yet. Not officially. They have no idea what is coming. "Then you had better find a way to tell them," Thessaly said. "Because in 6 hours, that fleet will reach their orbit. And Kale, listen to me carefully. Our 40 ships could not slow the enemy down. Do you understand what I am telling you? If this primitive little planet cannot survive contact, there will be nothing left to observe." The channel cut. I stood alone on the observation deck, staring down at Earth, watching the Terminator line slowly creep across its surface, day sliding into night over cities full of people who did not know their world was about to be tested in a way no Coalition world had ever faced. I had a human friend. His name was Daniel Ashford, a scientist working at a research outpost hidden beneath the mountains of a country called Norway, one of the few humans who knew Coalition observers existed. We had built our friendship slowly, over years of careful conversation, him teaching me the strange contradictions of his species, me teaching him fragments of galactic history that the Coalition allowed me to share. I opened a direct line to him. His face appeared, tired, his eyes red from lack of sleep, a coffee cup in his hand. "Kale, it is the middle of the night here," he said, forcing a smile. "This better be good. Daniel, listen to me. I need you to trust everything I am about to say, even though there will be no time to prove it." His smile faded. He set the cup down. "You have never used that tone with me before. There is a fleet coming," I said. "Not one of ours. Something worse. It destroyed a Coalition battle group of 40 ships in less than a day, and it is heading toward your planet." Daniel did not move for several seconds. When he spoke, his voice was steady in a way that surprised me. "How long do we have?" 6 hours, maybe less." "And what does your Coalition recommend we do?" I hesitated, because the truth was ugly. Commander Oren believes Earth cannot survive contact. She believes there is nothing meaningful your people can do in 6 hours that would change the outcome. Daniel was silent, and I braced myself for panic, for despair, for the kind of collapse I had read about in human psychological studies, the fear response that supposedly defined a species too disorganized to face true crisis. Instead, he stood up from his chair, and something changed in his expression. It was not fear, it was focus. KL, I need you to patch me into every government channel your systems can reach. Every military command center on this planet. Right now. Daniel, they will not listen to a scientist telling them aliens are invading. They will listen to a warning, backed by real data, he said, already typing on a second console beside him. Give me the trajectory of that fleet. Give me anything you have. I will make them listen. I transmitted the data, still uncertain this was anything more than a desperate gesture from a species that had never fought a war beyond its own atmosphere. But something in Daniel's calm made me pause. I had studied humans for 3 years, and I had always focused on their conflicts, their divisions, their inability to agree on almost anything. I had never truly watched what happened when they were given a single, undeniable threat. Within the hour, something began to shift across the planet that made my instruments strain to keep up. Radio chatter across dozens of languages surged. Military bases that had been operating on peacetime schedules suddenly lit up with activity. I watched satellite feeds show fighter jets rolling out of hangars in numbers that made no operational sense unless someone truly believed this threat was real. Command centers that I knew, from years of observation, rarely spoke to each other without arguments over politics, were suddenly sharing raw data in real time. I called Daniel back. How did you convince them so quickly? He looked exhausted, but there was something else in his eyes now, something sharp. I did not convince them of anything, Kale. I showed them proof, and I told them the truth. Humans argue about almost everything. That part is true. But we have one thing your coalition maybe does not understand. When the threat is big enough and real enough, we stop arguing and we act. We have been doing that to each other for thousands of years. Turns out it works just as well against something from outside. I did not fully believe him. 3 years of observation had shown me a species divided by borders, by ideas, by old grudges that stretched back generations. I expected disorder. I expected the kind of chaos that Commander Oren predicted, humans running in every direction with no coordination, easy prey for whatever was coming. What I saw instead, over the following hours, unsettled every assumption I had built about this planet. Military satellites that belonged to rival nations began sharing tracking data. Radar stations that had spent decades pointed at each other in quiet suspicion turned their full attention outward, toward the black sky above. I watched a live broadcast where leaders from opposing countries, men and women who had spent years exchanging insults across negotiating tables, appeared together on a single emergency channel, their faces grim but united. Daniel appeared on my screen again, his voice hoarse now from hours of talking. Kale, we need everything you can give us. Ship classifications, weapon signatures, anything from your coalition archives about this enemy. There is almost nothing, I admitted. No one has fought them and survived to write a full report. Then give me what little you have, and give me your honest opinion, not the coalition's official position, yours. I paused, unsure how to answer. In 3 years, no human had ever asked for my personal opinion on anything important. They asked for facts, for data, for confirmation of theories. Daniel was asking me to think like someone who had a stake in the outcome, not like an observer standing safely outside events. My honest opinion, I said slowly, is that Earth's technology is decades behind what is required to survive a direct engagement with a fleet that erased 40 coalition ships. Your weapons cannot penetrate their shielding. Your ships cannot match their speed. By every measurement your coalition dossier assigns to a young civilization, Earth should not survive first contact with a threat like this. Daniel absorbed this without flinching. Okay. Then we do not fight them the way your coalition fights. We fight them the way we know how. I did not understand what he meant. Not yet. I had spent years cataloging human weaknesses, their short lifespans, their fragile bodies, their endless internal disagreements. I had never once cataloged what happened when all of that fractured energy pointed in a single direction at once. 2 hours before the enemy fleet was projected to reach Earth's orbit, I watched something that made every instrument on my console spike with confusion. Instead of scattering their defenses across the globe in a disorganized panic, humanity's militaries began moving with a coordination that even coalition fleets sometimes struggled to achieve. Aircraft carriers changed course toward predicted impact zones. Missile silos that had stood dormant for decades came online. Civilian aircraft were grounded within minutes, clearing the skies for military use. Communication satellites were repurposed, their signals redirected to create a planet-wide early warning net, stitched together in a matter of hours from technology that was, by galactic standards, ancient. I reported all of this to Commander Oren, expecting her to dismiss it as meaningless motion, noise before an inevitable collapse. Instead, when her face appeared on my screen again, she looked troubled in a way I had not seen before. "Kale, I am reviewing your data feed," she said. "This coordination, is it accurate? There is no error in your instruments." "No error, Commander. They organized this in under 2 hours." She was quiet for a long moment. "Our own coalition worlds require council votes lasting days before agreeing on emergency protocols. How is this possible for a species you have described to me as fractured and quarrelsome?" I thought of Daniel's words. "When the threat is big enough, we stop arguing and we act." I did not have a better explanation to offer her. "I do not know, Commander," I admitted. "But I believe we may have underestimated something important about this planet." She did not respond to that. She simply closed the channel, and I was left alone again, watching the skies above Earth fill with aircraft, watching cities darken their lights as a precaution against attacks nobody fully understood yet, watching a species the coalition had written off as primitive prepare to face something that had already destroyed one of our finest fleets. Daniel called me one final time before the enemy fleet was due to arrive. His face was pale with exhaustion, but his eyes held something steady, something that did not match the fear I expected. "Kale," he said quietly, "whatever happens in the next few hours, thank you for the warning. Without it, we would not have had any chance at all." "You still may not have a chance," I said, hating how honest it sounded. "Maybe not," he agreed, "but we get to choose how we meet it. That matters more than you think." I looked down at the planet below, its cities glowing faintly beneath a layer of clouds, utterly unaware just months ago that anything beyond their own sky existed, now bracing itself against an enemy capable of erasing worlds. I had spent 3 years believing I understood humanity. Watching them organize in those final hours before the fleet arrived, I realized I understood almost nothing at all. Somewhere beyond the orbit of the outer planets, the Devourer fleet was closing in, unstoppable, having already proven itself against forces far more advanced than anything Earth possessed. And somewhere below me, a species born on a single fragile world, a species we had called primitive for as long as I had studied them, was preparing to meet that enemy with everything they had. I did not know, in that moment, whether I was about to witness the end of a civilization or the beginning of something the galaxy had never seen before. The first ship appeared on my screen as a single point of light, then 2, then 100, then more than my instruments could count fast enough. The Devourer fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the solar system, and even from this distance, the raw size of it made my hands shake against the console. Commander Oren had told me 40 coalition ships could not slow them down. Looking at the swarm, now filling my screen, I finally understood why. I opened every channel I had to Daniel, to the human command centers, to anyone who would listen. They have arrived. I am transmitting positions now. On the ground, sirens began sounding across cities I had spent years studying from orbit. I watched through satellite feeds as streets emptied, as families moved into shelters built decades ago for a different kind of war, one fought only among themselves. I felt something strange settle into my chest as I watched, a feeling I did not have a proper word for in my own language, something between guilt and dread. These people did not choose this fight. It had been carried to their doorstep by forces they had never even known existed until a few hours earlier. The first wave of enemy ships broke off from the main fleet and descended toward low orbit, exactly the way the reports from the frontier had described before those outposts went silent. I braced myself for the same outcome here. I expected human resistance to collapse within minutes, the way every previous target had. It did not happen that way. The first defense came not from Earth's surface, but from orbit itself. A network of aging satellites, decades old by galactic standards, some of them originally built for weather tracking and communication, suddenly redirected their sensors and began feeding targeting data to ground-based defense systems with a precision that startled me. I had assumed these systems were obsolete. I had filed reports calling them primitive without ever considering how they might be repurposed under pressure. Missile batteries along coastlines and mountain ranges fired in coordinated waves, guided by the satellite network humans had stitched together in the hours before the attack. The missiles themselves were nothing special by coalition standards: chemical propulsion, decades-old designs, weapons that any advanced species would have considered a museum piece. But there were so many of them, launched with such precise timing, that the enemy's first wave was forced to divert its formation, breaking apart to avoid the sheer volume of incoming fire. I watched 3 enemy vessels take damage, their shields flickering under the barrage, something Commander Oren had told me should have been impossible against coalition weaponry itself, let alone human technology, decades behind our own. "Kale," Daniel's voice came through my console, tense but controlled. "Are you seeing this?" "I am seeing it," I said, unable to keep the disbelief out of my voice. "How did your defense network calculate firing solutions against a target profile it has never encountered before?" "We did not calculate a firing solution for their exact ships," Daniel said. "We calculated a firing solution for volume. Enough missiles in the same airspace at the same time, and even a superior ship has to maneuver or take damage. It does not matter how advanced their shields are if they cannot process 1,000 threats at once." It was such a simple idea, and yet nothing in the Coalition's centuries of doctrine had prepared me to see it applied with such immediate effectiveness. Our military strategies were built around precision, around targeted strikes against known weaknesses. Humans, faced with an enemy they knew almost nothing about, had simply overwhelmed the unknown with numbers and timing. The enemy fleet regrouped quickly, adjusting its approach, sending a second wave lower and faster, splitting into smaller groups to avoid presenting an easy target. I recognized the adjustment. It was the kind of adaptive maneuver coalition fleets used against each other in formal engagements. It should have worked against a defense built from decades-old missile technology. It nearly did. Several coastal cities lost their defense networks within minutes as the second wave descended, enemy weapons tearing through structures with a violence that made my throat tighten as I watched the feeds. I forced myself to keep recording, keep reporting, even as the losses mounted on the ground. But something else began happening that the enemy clearly had not accounted for. As their ships descended into the lower atmosphere to press their advantage, they entered range of weapons systems that had nothing to do with orbital combat at all. Anti-aircraft batteries, originally designed to counter human aircraft in human wars, opened fire from positions scattered across cities, mountains, and open plains. These were not sophisticated weapons by any galactic standard. They were built to shoot down machines flown by other humans, weapons refined over a century of conflict between nations that no longer existed as separate powers today, only because they had finally chosen, in this one crisis, to stand together. I watched an enemy scout ship, sleek and fast, the kind of vessel our own reports described as nearly untouchable in atmospheric combat, take a direct hit from what my scanners identified as a weapon system over 60 years old. The ship spiraled and crashed into open farmland outside a city whose name I recognized from years of quiet observation. Daniel's voice came through again, sharper now, edged with something I had never heard from him before. Not fear. Something closer to determination, sharpened into focus. Kale, patch me into your orbital scanners. I need real-time positioning on their fleet, not just what our own satellites can see. I complied instantly, feeding him everything my coalition instruments could gather. Within minutes, that data was being distributed across dozens of command centers around the planet, human commanders adjusting their strategies in real time based on information their own technology could never have gathered alone. It was, I realized with a strange twist of feeling, the first true partnership between coalition observation and human military action, and it was happening in the middle of a battle that could still end in complete disaster. The enemy commander, whatever intelligence guided that fleet, seemed to grow frustrated with the resistance it encountered. I watched formation patterns shift again, more aggressive now, ships descending closer to major population centers in what I recognized from coalition records as a decapitation strategy, an attempt to destroy command and communication infrastructure directly rather than continuing to grind through defensive lines. This was the moment Commander Oren had warned me about. This was where, according to every prior engagement on record, resistance typically collapsed, command structures failed, communication broke down, defense became disorganized panic. Instead, I watched something that made even my coalition-trained instincts struggle to process what I was seeing. As enemy ships descended toward major cities, human military commanders began executing what I later learned was called a mobile command protocol, a strategy developed decades earlier during a period of tension between major nations, when leaders feared exactly this kind of decapitation strike, though back then the fear had been of each other rather than an alien invasion. Command centers evacuated on schedules practiced so many times that the transition happened with almost no loss of coordination. Backup communication systems activated automatically. Decision-making authority transferred seamlessly to secondary commanders in bunkers hundreds of kilometers from the primary targets. It was, I realized with something like awe, a defense built from generations of humans preparing for the worst version of each other, now protecting them from something far worse than anything they had imagined when they built these systems. Daniel appeared on my screen again, his face lit by the glow of multiple monitors around him, sweat on his brow but his voice steady. "Kale, tell your Commander Oren something for me." "What would you like me to tell her?" "Tell her we are not done yet." I relayed the message, and for the first time since this crisis began, Commander Oren's face on my screen showed something other than grim calculation. She looked, unmistakably, surprised. "They have held for 3 hours against a fleet that destroyed 40 of our ships in less time than that," she said quietly, almost to herself. "Kale, pull every scrap of tactical data you can gather. I want to understand how this is possible." Below me, the battle continued to rage across Earth's skies and ground, missile trails crossing the darkness, enemy ships weaving between defenses that should not have been able to touch them and yet somehow kept finding their mark. Cities burned in places, and I forced myself to record it all, the losses as real as the small, stubborn victories. I thought of everything I had written in my reports over 3 years: primitive weapons, fractured governments, a species too divided to organize effective defense. I had believed every word of it when I wrote it, because it had been true, in the narrow sense that coalition doctrine measured such things. What I had failed to understand, watching missiles built from technology decades old tear through an enemy fleet that had erased 40 of our finest ships, was that humanity's history of conflict, all those wars and rivalries and grudges I had catalogued as evidence of their primitiveness, had also forged something the Coalition had never needed to develop. A species that had spent its entire recorded history fighting itself had learned lessons about survival, about adaptation, about refusing to break under pressure, that no peaceful Coalition world had ever been forced to learn. The enemy fleet pulled back from its aggressive descent as the fourth hour of engagement began, regrouping at higher orbit, clearly recalculating its approach against resistance it had not expected from a world its own scans must have classified as insignificant. I watched their formation shift into something more cautious, more deliberate, and I understood, with a chill that had nothing to do with temperature, that whatever intelligence commanded that fleet was beginning to take Earth seriously. Daniel's voice came through one more time before the channel went quiet, exhaustion finally beginning to show beneath the adrenaline. "Kale, we bought ourselves time. That is all this was. Time. Now we need to figure out what comes next, because they are not leaving, and we cannot keep absorbing hits like this forever." I looked down at the smoke rising from cities across the planet, at the enemy fleet regrouping in the dark beyond the atmosphere, and I understood that this had never been a single battle to win or lose. It was the opening move in something much longer and much harder, and for the first time since I arrived on this assignment, I found myself hoping, with an intensity that surprised me, that the species I had once dismissed as primitive would find a way to survive what was still coming. 3 days passed before the enemy fleet attempted another major assault, and in that time I watched humanity do something no Coalition report had ever prepared me to understand. They did not spend those 3 days in fear, waiting helplessly for the next wave. They spent them preparing, adapting, and turning their own history of conflict into a weapon more dangerous than anything in their arsenal. Daniel had not slept properly since the first attack, and neither had I, though for very different reasons. My exhaustion came from watching, recording, trying to make sense of behavior that broke every pattern the Coalition had ever documented about young civilizations under threat. His exhaustion came from something far more immediate, coordinating a defense effort that stretched across an entire planet with almost no time to rest. "Kale," he said during one of our brief calls, his voice rough but alert, "I need you to understand something about what is happening down here, because I do not think your Coalition report writers back home have any idea." "Then explain it to me," I said. "Because everything I am seeing contradicts what I was taught to expect." He rubbed his eyes and leaned closer to the screen. "For most of our history, humans have fought wars against each other. Small wars, big wars, wars that lasted generations. We got very good at figuring out how to win when we were outnumbered, outgunned, or facing an enemy who thought differently than we did. That knowledge did not disappear just because this time the enemy came from space instead of the next country over. I thought of the missile barrage that had staggered the enemy's first wave, of the mobile command protocols that had kept human leadership functioning under direct attack. You are saying your species treats this the same way it has treated every conflict before. Not the same, Daniel said. Worse, from their perspective, every war we have ever fought against each other, we fought with rules, or at least the illusion of rules. Treaties, conventions, lines we agreed not to cross because we knew we might be on the other side of that line someday. This enemy does not offer us that comfort. There is no negotiating table waiting for us if we lose. That changes how we fight. I did not fully understand what he meant until the second wave of enemy assaults began, and I watched humanity execute strategies that made even Commander Oren, watching from a Coalition vessel far outside the system, go quiet with something between admiration and unease. The enemy had learned from its first encounter. Its ships approached in smaller, more dispersed formations this time, avoiding the concentrated missile barrages that had disrupted their earlier assault. They targeted infrastructure first, power grids, communication towers, anything that might weaken human coordination before the main assault began. It was a sound strategy, the kind any coalition tactician would have approved. Humanity's response was not to defend every target equally. Instead, military commanders made a series of calculated decisions that I found difficult to process at first. Decisions that prioritized certain cities and infrastructure over others, accepting losses in some areas to concentrate overwhelming force in positions that mattered more to the larger strategy. It was cold, precise, and utterly unlike the emotional, reactive defense I had expected from a species I once described in my reports as impulsive. "You are sacrificing some of your own people to protect others," I said to Daniel during one tense exchange, unable to keep the discomfort out of my voice. His expression did not soften, but there was pain in it, carefully controlled. "We are making the same choice every commander in history has had to make when resources are limited and the enemy is not going to stop coming. I do not enjoy it, Kale. But if we spread our defense evenly across every target, we will lose everything. If we concentrate strength where it counts, we have a chance to win enough battles to matter." I relayed this reasoning to Commander Oren, and her reaction surprised me. "That is coalition doctrine," she said slowly. "We teach that exact principle in our command academies, concentration of force over even distribution. I did not expect a species, barely a century into powered flight, to already understand it instinctively." "They did not learn it from your academies," I told her. "They learned it from centuries of fighting each other. The battle that followed became the moment I would later understand as the true turning point of Earth's defense, though at the time it felt like nothing more than desperate improvisation under fire. The enemy launched a major assault against a coastal region, sending a significant portion of its fleet toward what coalition scans indicated was a critical human population and industrial center. Human commanders, anticipating exactly this kind of move, based on patterns Daniel and his analysts had identified from the enemy's previous behavior, executed a plan that still makes my processing core hesitate when I recall it, because it worked precisely because it defied every principle of engagement the coalition holds sacred. Rather than meeting the enemy fleet head-on with everything available, human forces allowed the initial wave to advance further than seemed wise, drawing enemy ships deeper into range of coordinated ground-based weapon systems positioned specifically for this scenario. It was a deception, plain and simple, the kind of tactic that required convincing an intelligent enemy that a path forward was safe, when it was, in fact, a trap generations in the making. I watched enemy formations advance confidently into what looked like a gap in human defenses, only to find themselves caught between weapon systems positioned on both sides, a pincer maneuver executed with a precision that suggested years, maybe decades, of practiced military doctrine, all of it originally designed for wars fought entirely between humans, now turned against an enemy from beyond the stars. "This should not work," I said to Daniel, watching enemy ships take damage from multiple directions simultaneously, their formation collapsing into disorganized retreat. "A species with technology this far beyond your own should have anticipated a trap." "They should have," Daniel agreed, watching the same feeds with an expression I could only describe as fierce concentration. "But they are used to fighting enemies who think the way they do. Efficient, logical, predictable within certain parameters. We do not always fight that way, Kale. Sometimes the smartest move on paper is not the move a desperate, angry species makes when everything is on the line." The enemy fleet retreated from that engagement, having lost more ships in a single encounter than in their entire advance toward Earth combined. I transmitted the full tactical breakdown to Commander Oren, and her response, when it came, carried a weight I had not heard from her before. "Kale, I need you to understand something," she said. "The Devourer fleet has engaged 42 coalition worlds since first contact. Every single one of those worlds fell within days, most within hours. Earth has now held for 3 days and inflicted more confirmed losses on that fleet than the previous 6 worlds combined. What does that mean for the coalition's plans? I asked. She hesitated, and in that hesitation, I heard something rare from a coalition commander: genuine uncertainty. It means we may have been wrong about many things. It means High Command is now debating whether Earth deserves resources we would never have considered allocating to an unrecognized world only days ago. I relayed none of this to Daniel immediately, uncertain how he would react to learning that his planet's survival was being weighed and measured by people who had, until very recently, considered his species beneath serious consideration. Instead, I focused on what mattered in the moment, helping him and his fellow commanders prepare for what everyone now understood would be an even larger assault, because an enemy fleet that had never before faced meaningful resistance was not going to accept these losses without escalating its response. The days that followed blurred into a rhythm of preparation and small engagements, probing attacks from the enemy, testing different approaches, different formations, searching for a weakness in defenses that had proven far more resilient than expected. I watched human engineers work around the clock, repurposing civilian technology for military use, retrofitting commercial satellites into makeshift sensor networks, converting factories that once produced vehicles into facilities churning out ammunition and defensive systems at a pace that startled even me. Daniel showed me one such facility during a brief video call, a factory floor that had, less than a week earlier, produced automobiles for civilian use, now filled with workers of every age assembling components for the missile systems that had proven so effective against the enemy's first waves. These people were building cars 5 days ago, Daniel said, turning his camera to show rows of workers moving with practiced efficiency despite clear exhaustion on many of their faces. Now they are building the things keeping this planet alive. Nobody ordered them to volunteer for these shifts, Cale. They just showed up. I thought about coalition worlds, where military production required lengthy council approvals, resource allocation debates that could stretch for cycles even during declared emergencies. I thought about the rigid structures that governed how our civilization mobilized for war, structures built for stability and consensus rather than speed. Your species organizes for crisis faster than mine does, I admitted to Daniel, the words feeling strange as I spoke them, an admission I would never have imagined making 3 years earlier. I do not fully understand how. Daniel considered this for a moment before answering. Maybe it is because we never had the luxury of assuming things would stay stable. Every generation of humans has lived through some kind of crisis, some kind of war, some kind of disaster. We built our systems to move fast because moving slow got people killed too many times before. Your coalition has been at peace long enough that maybe you forgot how urgent things can get. It was not an insult, though it could have been taken as one. It was simply an observation, delivered with the same clear-eyed honesty Daniel had shown me since the moment this crisis began. And as I reviewed coalition history that night, searching through centuries of records for the last time our civilization had faced a threat requiring this kind of immediate, decisive mobilization, I found myself unable to locate a comparable example. We had grown complacent in our stability, confident in our technological superiority, and it had left us unprepared for an enemy that did not respect the assumptions our peace had been built upon. The next major assault came 6 days after the first attack, and it dwarfed everything that had come before it. The Devourer fleet, having studied human tactics across a week of engagements, arrived with a force nearly double their initial deployment, spreading across the planet in a coordinated assault designed to overwhelm every defensive position simultaneously, denying human commanders the ability to concentrate their forces the way they had in previous victories. I watched the scale of it unfold on my screens with a growing sense of dread. This was the moment, I feared, when the enemy's overwhelming technological advantage would finally assert itself against a defense that had, until now, relied heavily on surprise, deception, and tactics the enemy had not yet learned to counter. Surprise was gone now. The enemy understood, at least partially, what it was facing. Daniel's voice came through my console, and for the first time since this crisis began, I heard genuine strain beneath his controlled exterior. "Kale, this is different. They are hitting everything at once. We cannot concentrate force the way we did before. There is nowhere to concentrate it to." "What will you do?" I asked, unable to offer any solution of my own, my coalition training providing no answers for a scenario this far outside established doctrine. There was a pause, and when Daniel spoke again, his voice carried a certainty that surprised me, given the circumstances. "We adapt again. That is what we do, Kale. That is the only thing we have ever known how to do." What followed over the next several hours became, in later coalition analysis, one of the most studied engagements in recent galactic military history, though at the time it felt like nothing more than chaos held together by sheer determination. Unable to concentrate their forces in the traditional sense, human commanders instead distributed decision-making authority down to local levels, trusting smaller units and even individual commanders to make tactical decisions in real time, rather than waiting for centralized direction that could not possibly respond fast enough to a threat unfolding simultaneously across an entire planet. It should have resulted in disorganized chaos. Dozens of uncoordinated defenses acting without a unified strategy, exactly the kind of failure coalition doctrine predicted for any force lacking centralized command during a crisis. Instead, something remarkable happened. Local commanders, trained under a shared doctrine and given clear objectives even without constant oversight, began making decisions that, while individually improvised, collectively formed a defense more resilient and adaptable than any centrally planned strategy could have achieved. I watched a defense unit in one country independently develop a tactic involving coordinated strikes, timed to enemy shield regeneration cycles, information they had gathered from their own local engagements rather than any central intelligence briefing. Within hours, that tactic had spread to other units through informal communication channels, commanders sharing what worked and what did not in real time, refining their collective approach faster than any top-down command structure could have managed. "This is remarkable," I said to Commander Oren during one of our updates, watching the tactical data flow in from dozens of independent engagements across the planet. "They are functioning almost like a distributed intelligence, each unit learning and adapting independently while somehow still moving toward a coherent overall strategy. It should not be possible without centralized coordination," she replied, though her tone suggested she was no longer certain what should or should not be possible where humanity was concerned. "Perhaps that is exactly why it works," I said. "They do not need centralized coordination because their doctrine trusts individuals to make sound decisions within a shared framework. It is inefficient by our standards, but it is also nearly impossible for an enemy to predict or disrupt, because there is no single point of failure to target." The battle raged for nearly 10 hours, longer than any single engagement since the war began, and by its end, the Devourer fleet had suffered losses severe enough that its remaining forces withdrew to high orbit, regrouping at a distance that suggested, for the first time, genuine caution rather than tactical repositioning. I looked at the final tallies as they came in, comparing them against the fate of the 42 coalition worlds that had fallen before Earth, and I understood, with a clarity that reshaped everything I thought I knew about this species, that we had been measuring the wrong things all along. Technology mattered, firepower mattered, but something else mattered more, something the coalition's peaceful, orderly civilization had never been forced to develop. A stubborn, adaptive, decentralized resilience, born from a history the humans themselves might have called primitive, but which I now understood as something far more valuable than anything in our advanced arsenals. News of Earth's resistance spread through coalition channels faster than anything I had witnessed in my career. Within days, what had begun as a minor observation post assignment became the center of attention for military analysts across a dozen member worlds. I found myself fielding requests for data from officers I had never spoken to before, all of them asking the same question in different words. How is this possible? Commander Oren called me for a briefing that felt different from every conversation we had shared before. Her tone had shifted from cautious concern to something closer to urgent respect, though she would never have used that word herself. Kale, High Command has authorized a change in Earth's classification, she said. Effective immediately, Earth is no longer listed as an unrecognized primitive world. It has been reclassified as an active combatant with confirmed engagement success against the Devourer fleet. I felt something unfamiliar settle in my chest, a kind of vindication mixed with worry. What does that mean in practical terms? It means we are sending support, she said, advisors, limited resources, and observers to study their tactics directly. High Command wants to understand what your humans are doing, Kale, because whatever it is working better than anything our own forces have managed against this enemy. I relayed this to Daniel during our next call, watching his expression shift from exhaustion to something more complicated, pride tangled with wariness. Advisors, he repeated. So now that we are winning, the people who called us primitive want to learn from us. I understand if that feels unfair, I said, and I meant it. I had spent 3 years filing reports that dismissed his species as unworthy of serious consideration, and I could not undo the sting of that history simply because circumstances had changed. Daniel was quiet for a moment before answering. It is unfair, Kale, but it does not matter right now. We need every advantage we can get, and if your coalition finally wants to treat us as partners instead of curiosities, I am not going to let pride get in the way of saving lives. Just do not expect us to forget how this started. That is fair, I said, and I meant that too. The first coalition advisors arrived within the week, a small team led by a tactical officer named Vane Kalor, someone I had worked with briefly years earlier during a training assignment. Vane's reputation preceded him, a rigid, by-the-book officer who had built his career on textbook coalition doctrine. I worried his presence might create friction with human commanders who had spent the past 2 weeks proving that unconventional thinking was exactly what this war required. My worry proved justified almost immediately. During his first joint strategy session with human military leadership, Vane proposed a defensive formation lifted directly from coalition training manuals, a careful, methodical approach that prioritized minimizing casualties over aggressive engagement. A human commander named Grace Whitfield, who had led several of the successful engagements against the Devourer fleet, listened to his proposal with visible patience before responding. With respect, that plan would have gotten us destroyed in the first hour. Your coalition doctrine assumes an enemy that respects predictable patterns. This enemy does not fight that way anymore, not against us. Vane seemed genuinely surprised by the pushback, a reaction that told me everything about how accustomed coalition officers were to their expertise going unchallenged. Commander Whitfield, this doctrine has been refined over centuries of coalition military experience. And our tactics have been refined over the past 2 weeks against the specific enemy actually attacking us. Grace replied evenly. I respect what your coalition has built. But right now, I trust the lessons we are learning in real time more than lessons written for a different kind of war. I watched this exchange with a strange mixture of concern and admiration, uncertain how it would resolve. To my surprise, and I suspect to Vane's as well, he did not dismiss her objection outright. Instead, he asked her to walk him through the reasoning behind the engagements that had succeeded, listening with genuine attention as she explained the decentralized command structure, the deception tactics, the willingness to accept calculated losses in pursuit of larger strategic goals. By the end of that session, Vane's proposed formation had been scrapped entirely, replaced by a hybrid approach that combined coalition sensor technology and ship design with human tactical doctrine, a combination that neither side could have developed alone. This became the pattern over the following weeks as more coalition resources arrived. It was not a simple story of advanced aliens teaching primitive humans how to fight properly, the narrative I suspect some in coalition high command had quietly expected. It was something far more complicated and, I came to believe, far more valuable. A genuine exchange where each side contributed strengths the other lacked. Coalition engineers helped retrofit human ships with improved shielding technology, extending their survivability in engagements that would previously have proven fatal within minutes. In exchange, human tacticians reshaped how coalition forces approached combat entirely, introducing concepts around decentralized command, psychological deception, and calculated risk that coalition doctrine had never seriously considered necessary during centuries of relatively stable, rule-bound conflicts between member worlds. I spent increasing amounts of my time, not as a passive observer, but as an active liaison, translating not just language, but philosophy between two very different military cultures, learning to fight side by side against a common threat. It was exhausting work, but it was also, I found myself admitting during quiet moments, the most meaningful work I had done in my entire career. Daniel and Grace became unlikely leaders of this integration effort on the human side, their credibility earned through actual combat success rather than rank or political standing. I watched Daniel transform over those weeks, from a scientist thrust unexpectedly into a crisis, into someone coalition officers increasingly deferred to on questions of strategy. His insight into both human capabilities and the enemy's evolving tactics proving invaluable again and again. "You have changed," I told him during one rare quiet moment between strategy sessions, both of us sharing a meal in the underground command center that had become the heart of Earth's joint defense effort. "We all have," he said, glancing toward the screens, still displaying tactical data, even during this brief pause. I used to spend my days studying rock formations and geological history. Now I am helping plan defenses against an alien invasion. I do not think anyone signs up for a transformation like that, Kale. It just happens, because it has to. I thought about my own transformation, from a coalition observer content to catalog human weaknesses from a safe distance, into someone who genuinely cared about the outcome of this war in ways that went beyond professional obligation. I understand that, more than you might think. The Devourer fleet, meanwhile, was not idle during this period of human and coalition integration. Smaller engagements continued across the following weeks, the enemy probing for weaknesses, testing new formations, occasionally launching larger assaults that tested the strength of the improving joint defense. Each engagement provided valuable data, and each engagement, though costly, ended with the enemy suffering losses it clearly had not anticipated when it first set its sights on what its own intelligence must have classified as an insignificant, undefended world. I began noticing something in the enemy's behavior that coalition analysts found deeply significant, a shift from confident, methodical assaults toward something closer to caution, even hesitation. Commander Oren shared updated intelligence suggesting the Devourer fleet's command structure, whatever intelligence guided it, was beginning to treat Earth not as another simple conquest, but as a genuine strategic problem requiring careful reconsideration. "They are afraid of us," Grace said during one strategy session, reviewing the same intelligence I had relayed to human command, or at least they are being forced to treat us as a real threat for the first time. That matters, Kale. That changes what comes next. "How so?" I asked, though I suspected I already understood. "An enemy that respects you fights differently than an enemy that dismisses you," she said. "We have spent 2 weeks proving we are not an easy target. Now we need to use that respect against them, before they figure out a way to counter everything we have built." This conversation became the foundation for what would become the largest coordinated offensive in the war so far, a plan Grace, Daniel, and a growing coalition of human and alien military leadership began developing together, drawing on lessons learned from every engagement since the war began. It was ambitious in a way that made even seasoned coalition officers like Vane Kalor pause with genuine concern, a plan that would require perfect coordination across human, coalition, and hybrid forces, striking at the Devourer fleet's main formation directly rather than continuing the defensive engagements that had characterized the war so far. "This is a significant escalation," Vane said during the planning session where the strategy was first presented in full. "If it fails, we will have committed the bulk of our combined forces to a single decisive engagement with no reserve to fall back on. If we do not take this risk, we will keep fighting a defensive war we cannot sustain indefinitely," Daniel replied. "Every engagement costs us ships, resources, and lives we cannot easily replace. The enemy can keep sending waves. We cannot keep absorbing them forever. At some point, we have to force a decisive outcome, on our terms, while we still have the strength to choose when and where that fight happens." I watched the room absorb this argument, coalition officers and human commanders alike weighing the enormous risk against the growing certainty that a purely defensive strategy would eventually exhaust Earth's resources regardless of how many small victories accumulated along the way. The debate stretched for hours. Technical details, contingency plans, and worst-case scenarios examined from every possible angle by minds representing two entirely different military traditions, now working, however uneasily, toward the same goal. In the end, the decision came down to a vote among the assembled command staff, a process that felt distinctly human in its structure, and I noted with some satisfaction that even the coalition officers present, trained in cultures that typically deferred to senior rank rather than collective decision-making, found themselves adapting to this method without significant complaint. Perhaps, I thought, watching hands raised around that table, this was simply what genuine partnership looked like, each side absorbing something valuable from the other, neither fully dominant, both essential to whatever outcome awaited them. The vote passed. The offensive would proceed, and preparations began immediately, drawing together everything both civilizations had learned about fighting this enemy. Every hard-won lesson, from weeks of desperate defense, now channeled into a single, decisive gamble that would determine whether Earth, and perhaps the wider coalition itself, would survive what still lay ahead. As the final preparations took shape, I found myself standing once more on the observation deck where this entire crisis had begun, looking down at a planet that had transformed in my understanding from a primitive backwater into something I genuinely struggled to find adequate words to describe. Resilient did not feel like enough. Adaptive did not capture the full truth of what I had witnessed. I settled, finally, on a word I had never applied to any civilization in 3 years of coalition service, a word that felt both simple and entirely accurate: worthy. Whatever happened in the battle to come, I understood now that Earth had already proven something the coalition would need to reckon with for a very long time. The primitive world we had dismissed without a second thought had become, through nothing more than its own stubborn refusal to accept defeat, one of the most capable military forces in the entire war against the Devourer fleet. What remained to be seen was whether that capability would be enough to finish what humanity had started, or whether the coming battle would prove, at last, the limit of what determination alone could achieve against an enemy that had never before been forced to retreat. The combined fleet gathered at the edge of the solar system 3 days after the vote, and I had never seen anything like it in my entire career. Human ships, retrofitted with coalition shielding technology, flew in formation alongside coalition vessels adapted to accommodate human tactical doctrine, an alliance forged in weeks that should have taken years to build under normal circumstances. Grace Whitfield commanded the human fleet's forward position, her voice steady across the joint communication network as she coordinated with Vane Kalor, who now deferred to her tactical judgment with a respect that would have seemed impossible only a month earlier. Daniel remained at the central command post on Earth, coordinating the ground-based defense that would need to hold steady while the offensive fleet engaged the Devourer fleet's main formation. I stayed with him, my role as liaison more critical now than ever, funneling real-time intelligence between the fleet, the ground command, and Commander Oren, who had arrived personally to oversee the coalition's contribution to this decisive engagement. "How are you feeling?" I asked Daniel as the final countdown to engagement approached, watching him review data streams with an intensity that had become familiar over the past weeks. "Terrified," he admitted, not looking up from his screens. "But that has been true since the moment you first called me about that fleet. Fear does not go away, Kale. You just learn to keep working through it." I thought about how much I had learned from watching humans navigate fear, not through its absence, but through their refusal to let it dictate their actions. It was, I had come to believe, one of the most significant lessons this war had taught the coalition, that courage was never about eliminating fear, but about acting decisively despite it. The engagement began at the coordinates the Devourer fleet's main formation had settled into, a position at the edge of the asteroid belt that coalition analysts believed represented their staging ground for future assaults against Earth. The combined human and coalition fleet approached in a formation that drew on everything both sides had learned: decentralized command structures allowing individual squadron leaders to make real-time decisions, deception tactics designed to draw enemy attention toward feints, while the true strike force approached from an unexpected vector, and overwhelming coordinated firepower concentrated at precisely calculated intervals to exploit the same shield regeneration patterns human forces had identified weeks earlier. The Devourer fleet, still operating under assumptions built from centuries of unbroken conquest, responded initially with the same confident, methodical formation that had served it well against 42 previous coalition worlds. I watched their ships spread into an engagement pattern designed to overwhelm through superior numbers and technology, the same approach that had proven devastatingly effective against every enemy they had faced until they encountered Earth. Grace's voice cut through the tactical channel, calm despite the enormity of what was unfolding. "All squadrons, execute Phase 1. Draw their attention toward the northern feint. Keep the true strike force dark until my signal." I watched the battle unfold across my screens with a mixture of professional detachment and genuine, personal investment that I had never experienced in 3 years of coalition service. Human fighter squadrons, smaller and less individually powerful than their coalition counterparts, moved with a coordinated aggression that drew enemy attention exactly as planned, sacrificing tactical position to create the opening the larger strike force needed. "They are taking the bait," Vane reported from his position, coordinating coalition heavy cruisers. Enemy formation shifting to intercept the northern feint, leaving their central formation exposed. "Hold until my signal," Grace repeated, and I could hear the weight of command in her voice, the knowledge that every second of delay increased risk to the squadrons drawing enemy fire, balanced against the necessity of allowing the trap to fully develop before springing it. The moment came with a precision that made even Commander Oren, watching from Earth's command center beside me, exhale sharply in something like disbelief. Grace gave the signal, and the true strike force, hidden until that exact moment through a combination of coalition stealth technology and human electronic countermeasures developed specifically for this engagement, revealed itself directly behind the Devourer fleet's exposed central formation. What followed was unlike anything documented in coalition military history. The combined strike force unleashed coordinated fire calculated to exploit the enemy's shield regeneration cycle. The same tactic that had proven effective in smaller engagements now scaled up to devastating effect against the enemy's primary formation. Enemy ships that had seemed nearly invulnerable during the war's opening days began taking catastrophic damage, their shields overwhelmed by an assault that struck with a coordination the Devourer fleet's command structure, built around centuries of unopposed dominance, simply had not prepared for. "Their formation is breaking," Vane reported, and I could hear something in his voice I had never expected from him, genuine excitement rather than clinical professional detachment. Kale, I have never seen tactics like this succeed against a numerically superior force. You are seeing them succeed right now, I said, watching the battle data stream across my console with something approaching disbelief of my own. The engagement continued for nearly 6 hours, ebbing and flowing as the Devourer fleet, its command structure clearly capable of adaptation despite its unfamiliarity with genuine resistance, attempted several countermaneuvers designed to regain the initiative. Each attempt was met by a combined human and coalition response that drew on the full breadth of what both civilizations had learned, fighting alongside each other. Human commanders providing the adaptive, decentralized tactical thinking that kept the enemy perpetually off balance. Coalition technology providing the raw capability to execute those tactics with a precision that pure human resources alone could not have achieved. I watched Daniel throughout those 6 hours, coordinating ground support and intelligence with an intensity that never wavered despite visible exhaustion, and I understood that I was witnessing something historic, not simply a battle, but the birth of a genuine partnership between two civilizations that had begun this war viewing each other through lenses of condescension and desperate necessity, now fighting side by side as true equals. The turning point came when Grace identified an opportunity to strike directly at what Coalition intelligence had identified as the Devourer fleet's command vessel, a massive ship at the heart of their formation that coordinated the movements of the surrounding fleet. Striking it directly was an enormous risk, the kind of decisive, aggressive maneuver that Coalition doctrine typically avoided in favor of more cautious, attritional approaches. Commander Whitfield, striking the command vessel directly carries significant risk to our forward squadrons, Vane cautioned, though his tone carried more genuine consultation than the rigid objection he might have offered weeks earlier. I know, Grace replied. But if we can disable their command coordination, the rest of their fleet loses cohesion. We have seen it happen in smaller engagements, individual ships, without central coordination, becoming vulnerable to exactly the kind of adaptive tactics we specialize in. This is our chance to end this decisively, rather than simply wearing them down over months of continued conflict. The decision, once again, came through consultation rather than unilateral command, Grace gathering input from squadron leaders across both human and coalition forces before committing to the strike. It was a process that would have seemed impossibly slow to coalition military tradition weeks earlier, and yet it produced a decision executed with a speed and coordination that belied the collaborative process behind it. The strike against the command vessel became the defining moment of the entire war. Human fighter squadrons, using tactics developed from decades of studying how to disable larger, more powerful targets through coordinated, precise strikes rather than brute force alone, penetrated the Devourer fleet's defensive screen through a combination of misdirection and sheer determination that left even Commander Oren watching in stunned silence. I watched the command vessel's shields fail under the combined assault, watched its defensive capabilities crumble as human and coalition weapons found the precise vulnerabilities that weeks of study and hard-won battlefield experience had identified. And when the vessel finally went dark, its systems failing under the sustained assault, I watched something remarkable happen across the rest of the Devourer fleet's formation. Without central coordination, the remaining enemy ships began exhibiting exactly the kind of disorganized, reactive behavior that Grace had predicted, individual vessels making increasingly erratic decisions without the guiding intelligence that had coordinated their movements throughout the war. The combined human and coalition fleet pressed the advantage immediately, striking at the disorganized enemy formation with a coordinated ferocity that turned what had begun as a difficult, uncertain engagement into a decisive rout. By the time the battle concluded, the Devourer fleet that had erased 42 coalition worlds without meaningful resistance had suffered losses severe enough to force what remained of it into full retreat, fleeing the solar system with a speed that suggested genuine desperation rather than tactical repositioning. It was the first confirmed retreat of that enemy fleet in the entire history of the war, and it had happened here, above a planet the Coalition had dismissed as primitive only weeks earlier. I stood beside Daniel in the command center as confirmation of the enemy's retreat came through, watching him absorb the news with an expression that shifted slowly from disbelief to something like exhausted, overwhelming relief. Around us, the command center erupted into a mixture of celebration and quiet, stunned processing. People who had spent weeks operating on adrenaline and determination, finally allowing themselves to feel the weight of what they had just survived. "We did it," Daniel said quietly, more to himself than to me. "You did it," I corrected gently. "This was your victory, built from everything your species learned, fighting for your own survival across your entire history. The Coalition provided tools, but the strategy, the determination, the refusal to accept defeat, that was entirely human." He looked at me then, and something in his expression made me understand that the relationship between our two civilizations had changed permanently, not simply because of a single battle won, but because of everything that battle represented about what genuine partnership between different peoples could achieve. Commander Oren approached us both, her expression carrying none of the detached professionalism she had maintained during our earliest interactions. "I owe you both an apology," she said, addressing Daniel directly for the first time since this crisis began. "I told Kale, weeks ago, that your world could not survive this war. I was wrong, and I do not say that lightly." Daniel accepted this with a grace that surprised me, though perhaps it should not have, given everything I had learned about him over these transformative weeks. "You were operating on the information you had at the time. We all were. What matters now is what we do going forward." In the days that followed, as the full scope of the victory became clear and the Devourer fleet's remnants retreated to whatever staging ground they had established beyond Coalition territory, I watched something remarkable unfold across official Coalition channels. Reports that had once described Earth in dismissive, condescending terms were quietly rewritten, updated, corrected. The word primitive disappeared entirely from official Coalition documentation regarding humanity, replaced by language that acknowledged, with genuine respect, the remarkable achievement Earth had accomplished against overwhelming odds. Formal invitations for full Coalition membership arrived within weeks, delivered not with the usual paternalistic conditions attached to newly discovered civilizations, but as genuine negotiations between equals, acknowledging Earth's demonstrated capability and the invaluable contributions its military doctrine had already made toward understanding and countering the Devourer threat more broadly. Daniel led the human delegation that negotiated the terms of that membership, insisting on conditions that reflected genuine partnership rather than subordination, terms that the Coalition, chastened by the lessons of recent weeks, accepted with far less resistance than such demands would have received only a month earlier. I remained on Earth throughout those negotiations, no longer simply an observer cataloging a primitive world for distant Coalition archives, but something closer to a genuine friend and colleague to the people I had once studied from a careful, professional distance. Standing beside Daniel during the final ceremony that formally welcomed Earth into full Coalition membership, I found myself reflecting on everything I had witnessed since that first alarm sounded on my console weeks earlier. I had come to this assignment believing I understood what made a civilization worthy of respect, measuring worth through technological advancement, through peaceful stability, through the absence of the kind of conflict that had defined so much of human history. I left that assignment, and that chapter of the war, understanding something far more nuanced and, I believed, far more true. Worth was not measured simply through what a civilization had built, but through what it was willing to become when everything it valued stood at risk of destruction. Humanity had been called primitive for generations of coalition observation, judged and found wanting by standards that failed to account for the very qualities that would ultimately prove essential to surviving an enemy the coalition itself could not defeat alone. Adaptability forged through conflict, determination refined through struggle, a willingness to make impossible choices when easier paths led only to certain defeat. As the ceremony concluded, and Earth officially took its place among the stars as a full and respected member of coalition civilization, I looked out at a planet that had transformed my understanding of what strength truly meant, and I understood, with a clarity I would carry for the rest of my career, that we had never truly known this world at all. We had called them primitive. We had been wrong, and in that mistake, in the humbling weeks it took to correct it, both our civilizations had discovered something far more valuable than either could have achieved alone. A partnership built not on assumed superiority, but on hard-won, mutual respect between two peoples who had learned, together, exactly what it meant to refuse defeat when everything hung in the balance.